Let's get started by thanking our wonderful sponsors who make this show possible every week. We can't thank them enough. With more screen usage and indoor time, myopia, also known as nearsightedness, is increasing and getting worse in children. Now, certified eye doctors can prescribe MySight One Day, the first and only FDA-approved soft contact lens to slow myopia progression in age-appropriate children. Visit CooperVision.com to find a Brilliant Futures certified eye doctor near you. Welcome back to part two of my interview with investigative journalist Carey Gillam. In this episode, Carey discusses her newest book, The Monsanto Papers, and the story of Lee Johnson. If you're new here and you like our interviews, press like, subscribe, share, and hit the bell to get notifications of great new interviews. And please leave comments. I think people are getting more aware now about what they eat, but I think most people just eat for what tastes good. Seeing patients every day, they're eating what tastes good. They're not really thinking about what they're putting in their bodies and making the connection, unfortunately, to, sickness to what they're eating. A lot of people feel that they wouldn't sell it if it was bad for me.
Oh my gosh. I know. Isn't that the constant struggle? I have three kids, so I know the constant struggle about, they just want what tastes good, right? And what tastes good is often that fast food burger or fries or whatever, that are loaded with the sodium and the additives and all of the, terrible things that addict people really to sugars and all of these things that are bad for us. You're right. I mean, but eating is, the food that we consume is foundational to our health. So what you're putting in your bodies is definitely sort of the primary factor in are you going to be healthy? How strong is your immune system? Are you going to be able to fight off disease? If you're putting trash in your body, you can't expect to be healthy.
You mentioned before that glyphosate, and there's a lot of different chemicals, but glyphosate in particular is a chemical chelator, and one of the things it chelates is calcium. Is there any studies that show that that it's related to osteopenia or osteoporosis by the amount of glyphosate or different chemicals that we put in our body? And then of course it chelates manganese, copper, zinc, and the zinc we need for our immune system. So we have a lower immune system, so maybe that increases our risk of getting an infection. Has there been any studies that you've come across or any writings that you've seen on that?
The most well known, I guess, are the ones that have really looked at this chelating impact, are studies out of Sri Lanka that tied this to some kidney disease there that they were seeing, high levels of kidney disease, and that study, was very controversial, or a couple of studies, sort of a series that was done, very controversial. The scientist was, roundly attacked and harassed and criticized by industry, and as have the scientists who've done a lot of this work. So that's hard for me to weigh in on. I really want to see a lot of research before I sort of sign off and say, okay, that looks like that's pretty well established, that's valid science. But yeah, there are people that are looking at all of this, but the weight of evidence, particularly with glyphosate right now, really shows a carcinogenic impact, particularly with non-Hodgkin lymphoma. There are a lot of studies that see an impact in the liver, different organs, but primarily in the liver with glyphosate. And there's an increasing amount of science that's showing that glyphosate might act as an endocrine disruptor. There was a recent study out last year that said, it looks like it meets maybe 8 of 10 sort of characteristics of an endocrine disruptor. But then there are scientific studies that say, absolutely not. It's not an endocrine disrupting chemical. So there's still debate about all that sort of thing. So I can't weigh in on osteoporosis and glyphosate, unfortunately.
So they add surfactants to glyphosate, I guess, when they're making Roundup or different chemicals, these herbicides. Why are they adding these surfactants, and what do they do, and are they even more toxic to our cells than glyphosate alone?
Yeah, so that's a really good point to bring up. Roundup, yes, does use something called a surfactant, and these essentially are supposed to be sort of benign additives that help make glyphosate more effective, that help get it into the leaves of the plant, stick to it here, and be absorbed into the plant where it can do its work and kill the plant. So these surfactants are supposed to be safe. The EPA has said, these are safe and glyphosate is safe. So we're just going to assume that when you put them all together, they've got to be safe. We're not going to worry about it. And that's been sort of a deep flaw of the regulatory system and regulatory oversight for decades, because the EPA never required long-term studies about the impacts of the actual formulations, actual Roundup that was being sold. They only required these in-depth long-term studies on the active ingredient, glyphosate. And what many researchers have found, including our US National Toxicology Program, is that these formulations are more toxic than glyphosate by itself, that there is a synergistic effect and impact. And one of the primary surfactants that Monsanto was using was actually banned in Europe because it was found to be so toxic and so dangerous. So,
Was that POEA?
POEA, right? So, and there's an email that I have from Monsanto in the EPA communications. This was a few years ago, and I just found it astounding. But the EPA is writing to Monsanto saying, okay, we need a list, because people are starting to really ask about these surfactants and these questions, and Europe is banning it and all of this. So the EPA wanted Monsanto to provide it with a long list of the surfactants that they had been using for like the last 40 years, because the EPA didn't know. My question was, shouldn't the EPA know this? I mean, they've allowed these products, they've approved these products on the market, and they're just now in 2016 asking Monsanto, hey, what have you been using since 1974? I just found that astounding.
So talk about dicamba, combining glyphosate with dicamba, and is it still available out there, dicamba? And because there's been some very significant side effects associated with it.
Yeah, so dicamba, again, when we spoke earlier about weed resistance and how farmers who were using glyphosate, Roundup Ready crops, how weed resistance really became a huge problem. So what the companies have said is the solution is just to use more weed killers. So what they came up with was, let's combine glyphosate with this weed killer called dicamba, and let's genetically alter crops again, a new line of crops that are genetically altered, so you can spray them directly with not only glyphosate, but you can spray them directly with dicamba. You can spray them with this mixture of dicamba and glyphosate. And again, the weeds hopefully will die and the crops won't. The problem with this is that dicamba has always been a very volatile herbicide, meaning that it doesn't like to stay where it's sprayed. It can move, in warm and on the wind and warm conditions, helps it to volatilize and to move off target. And so this is a huge problem as more dicamba is being used in farm country on genetically altered crops that are designed to be sprayed with it. You have all of these other crops that aren't. You have orchards, peach growers, and you have, watermelon, and you have vineyards and grape growers. You have all of these people who are growing things other than genetically altered crops. And when the dicamba drifts or moves, it, damages or wipes out their crops, their production. And so it's been a huge problem. And, hundreds of farmers have sued now over this and saying, you can't be spraying this stuff like this, directly over growing crops, because yeah, maybe your crops will be fine, but you're wiping out my crops. And it's been a real problem. I did a story for The Guardian not too long ago, because again, we got emails, sort of the bulk of my work is based on, internal documents and freedom of information documents. But we got all of these communications where Monsanto and BASF essentially are talking amongst themselves, and Monsanto is predicting that this exact thing will happen, that dicamba will damage all of these farm fields. And gosh, that'll probably encourage more farmers to want to buy their seeds, because you're going to want to protect yourself. So you're going to want to buy and grow Monsanto special patented GMO seeds, rather than something non-GMO, because if you're not, you're going to get wiped out.
And is it still being used today, dicamba?
It's still being used today. Yeah, there have been several court challenges. There was a court finding that the EPA had approved these dicamba herbicides, these new ones, illegally, had not followed the proper steps and needed to pull them off the market. The EPA didn't want to do that and did numerous maneuvers, and dicamba is still on the market.
And how about atrazine? What is that used for?
Atrazine, again, is another weed killer. These are all the top hits of weed killers, I guess. It's been found to have particularly harmful reproductive impacts. It's an older herbicide. It's one that we find quite often in water, in particular. So it's been a big concern. There's an interesting story about a scientist who, Syngenta, another big chemical company, agrochemical company, had hired this academic scientist to study atrazine and to understand, is this harmful? Is this potentially damaging to humans or to the environment? And they wanted his assurance that it was fine. And instead, he did his work and his research and came back and said, no, this is bad. This is a problem. And they then spent years tearing him down, trying to discredit him, harass him, ruin his reputation. It's been a whole story, a whole saga that's been uncovered and written about in different magazines and press. But it's atrazine is a top chemical used in agriculture right now, and it's, again, something that is not very helpful to our health.
And let's talk about about seeds. How is it possible to be able to patent seeds?
Well, the court has agreed, that these things don't happen in nature. When you're taking DNA, you're doing transgenic work. This doesn't happen in nature. This is unique and this is proprietary. And these companies have developed this trait, this genetic trait, and they can patent it, and then they can license it. And that's what Monsanto's been able to do, is license their traits. It's a whole business unit for the company, the licensing of genetic traits.
And what happens when the seeds blow onto the neighbor's property, the neighbor farmer, and they get sued? What's that all about?
Yeah, that was a whole another problem that came out with this, is that farmers who didn't want to make use of these genetically altered seeds, didn't want to pay the premiums and sign the agreements that said that they would only use these seeds for one season. And they wouldn't, save the resulting plant and then have seed that they could then replant, as is a traditional farming practice. What they found often was if their neighbor was planting these seeds, or a supplier of, there's contamination. It's very easy for these GMO plants to contaminate neighboring fields. And you've seen multiple examples, and what Monsanto would do is send investigators out into farm country to make sure that only those people who had signed agreements and purchased their seeds and paid those special prices were growing them. And if they found any hint of contamination, or a farmer who had these special GMO crops growing in his field, they would sue the farmer. And many farmers protested and said, we had no idea this was growing. This must have somehow contaminated my field. But these were hundreds of farmers that were involved in litigation like this.
So how do these farmers protect themselves against the wind blowing seeds into their farm?
Well, you'd have to talk to these different farmers, but a lot of them just ended up paying the money. Some farmers have said that their livelihoods were ruined by these lawsuits that were brought by Monsanto. But it's interesting to note that Monsanto had, there were some research stations where Monsanto was exploring Roundup Ready wheat, and growing experimental wheat in the Northwest. And when they shut down their project and decided they weren't going to grow Roundup Ready wheat anymore and shut that down, what we found was that neighboring fields were contaminated. And this Roundup Ready wheat that was supposed to be contained and managed and monitored, the company, Monsanto, couldn't even keep it contained itself, that it was contaminating other farm fields.
That brings up the desiccation with wheat. Explain what that is and why is that used?
Desiccation is a practice by farmers in which they want to dry out or, prepare a crop for harvest. Maybe they have damp and cool conditions and their fields aren't drying out evenly, or they want to accelerate the harvest, time for some reason. And so they can spray glyphosate directly over their crops just as they are about ready to harvest them, and it will kill or dry out the crop. The grain is already there, the grain is made. So they will dry this crop out and then they can go in and they can harvest. And this is a practice with a lot of different crops. Monsanto had a really nifty little sort of slick black brochure that they would give to farmers, hailing all the benefits of this trait or this technique. But again, what you see when you spray directly over a crop right before harvest, like wheat or oats or something like that, you get pretty high residues of that weed killer than in your flour, in the instance of wheat, or in your oatmeal for oats. So this has been a problem. The residues have been documented. They've been pretty shockingly high levels that have generated a lot of concern. So we started to see grain handlers tell these farmers, particularly in northern areas, of the U.S. or in Canada, we don't want you to do this anymore. Consumers are onto it. They don't like it. Bad idea. Don't do it anymore. So you're hopefully seeing this practice decline a bit.
Now, there's certain foods that are considered health foods. Like you go to a Japanese restaurant, edamame. You take vitamin C. The vitamin C, it could come from corn. High fructose corn syrup, not necessarily a health food, but to sweeten things. What should people do to try to protect themselves?
Yeah. Well, if you really want to avoid pesticides in your food, I mean, again, there aren't a lot of options. I mean, trying to go organic, which is sort of the certified program for growing food without synthetic pesticides, and with other practices that qualify for the organic standard. I mean, that's where you want to put your interest if that's your main concern. The organic standard is really the only thing we have now. That buying non-GMO, yes, you can buy, but wheat is non-GMO. So you can get something with wheat in it and it can be non-GMO, but if that wheat has been desiccated with glyphosate, you're going to have glyphosate residues in that wheat product, whether it's non-GMO or not. So really the organic way is the only way to go to avoid pesticides. Getting to know your local farmers, I guess. I've got a farm not too far from where I live, and they deliver every Tuesday morning, eggs and milk to my door and that sort of thing. Not everybody has that luxury. I live in Kansas, but it's just being more aware, being more educated, and being more engaged and involved in the food that you're putting in your body every day and feeding to your kids every day. Because as we talked about, it's foundational to the quality of your health and your future health for decades to come. So it's really important that people pay attention and do the research and decide for themselves, what can I do? What do I want to do to protect my health?
So we want to look for the organic label. Can we trust the organic label? And are there still pesticides in organics, but just a lot less?
It's not a perfect system. There's a lot of ways that pesticides can get into organic foods, unfortunately. So yeah, it's not pure and simple. For instance, we still, when you put fertilizer, you're spreading chicken litter or manure that's basically being used as fertilizer in organic production in organic farms, that chicken litter might be coming from chickens who were fed GMO grain, and there could be, and there are residues in their manure, and the residue gets into the soil and the food. So again, we are awash in pesticides in our world. We don't have a perfect system. We haven't had a government or regulatory structure that is focused on trying to reduce pesticides, that has acknowledged the impact that they have on our health. Hopefully that's starting to change. You're seeing, newer and louder voices, I think, and awareness is growing. The Biden administration has said they want to take a harder look at the EPA regulation of pesticides and other chemicals, and take into greater account the impacts on human health. But we don't know how that's going to play out yet. So personal accountability, involvement, and education is critical.
Do we have any senators or congresspeople that are true heroes fighting for this cause, or not really?
I would have to say not really, but you can find a few every now and then who speak up and say, yeah, I'm on board with that and want to, but you don't see leadership in the House or the Senate really who's pushing something through on this. Maybe it's because the newer and better educated, or the more junior members of Congress. But again, we need to have consumer awareness, taxpayer voices, if we're ever going to make change happen.
Before we were talking about, can we trust organic? If it says 100% natural, that's not organic.
No, that's not organic. No.
Didn't General Mills and Quaker Oats get in trouble for that a number of years ago?
There've been all sorts of sort of labeling litigation that's happened about, what are the claims that you're making on your cereal products or snacks or other sorts of things. Yeah, but yeah, a lot of potholes for consumers to dodge, I think.
How does it get into watermelon? How does these chemicals get into watermelon?
If it's in your water and it's in your soil, if it comes down in rainfall, I mean, is there any way to avoid getting it in watermelon, apples? I spent some time in Florida and talked to citrus growers, and you have glyphosate and other pesticides in your orange juice. I mean, the levels of pesticides showing up in oranges and orange juice, something you think is so healthy, is just insane, and they told me, gosh, if consumers knew, they would be outraged. So
Let's turn our attention to cancer. There's been a lot written on cancer, and in fact, in your book, it's one of the subtitles of your first book is cancer, and then we're going to get into your other book in a minute. The WHO, who knows if we can even trust the WHO anymore, but the WHO now classifies GMOs as a class 2 carcinogen. Can you explain that, and what's a class 2A carcinogen?
Well, I don't know if they classified GMOs as a carcinogen. In 2015, they classified glyphosate.
Glyphosate, I'm sorry, I corrected. Glyphosate, not GMOs. Glyphosate.
They classified glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen, and they said there was a particular association to non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And the industry promptly, attacked IARC. This is the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is part of the World Health Organization. And their job, which has been for years and years, this is a group of scientists that are independent, not part of the industry, and they come together and they examine widely used substances and try to determine if there's a carcinogenic potential associated with these. They're not a regulatory body, they're merely a scientific body that is considered sort of gold standard of independent cancer experts. And they have experts in epidemiology and toxicology and all sorts of things, look at published peer-reviewed literature that has taken place over many, many years, and then they talk about it and they weigh it and they determine what the data tells them, and then they come up with a classification. And so in the case of glyphosate, it was determined that it was a probable human carcinogen with a strong association to non-Hodgkin lymphoma.
How about other blood cancers such as leukemia?
Yeah, there have been different studies that show association like to acute myeloid leukemia, for instance. There have been other studies, and IARC noted this as well, that yes, links to many other types of cancers and problems.
Multiple myeloma is what I was.
Multiple myeloma, right. But they simply noted in their report that these epidemiology and other studies showed non-Hodgkin lymphoma in particular, which have been a real problem in farm country. Non-Hodgkin lymphoma was a real rising disease that has sort of leveled off in the last few years, but there was a dramatic rise in non-Hodgkin lymphoma for many years.
And you mentioned before about some neurological associations, IQ associations. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, well, in particular with this disease, this insecticide called chlorpyrifos. But yeah, there are scientists who look at glyphosate and other chemicals and the impacts on the brain and on early developmental issues. But chlorpyrifos is such an important example for people to understand how lacking our regulatory system is, I think. Chlorpyrifos is this insecticide that had been developed and sold and marketed and promoted by Dow Chemical for decades, and again widely used by farmers. One of the most widely used chemicals, insecticides. But the science for many years has been building, showing how dangerous it is to young children's brains, whether or not they're exposed in utero or shortly after birth, and how this can affect them in a lot of ways, with IQ and autism and ADHD and all of these sorts of things. And they banned it from household use in the year 2000 because it was shown to be so damaging to these kids. But we wanted to keep using it in agriculture. Our government said, and these companies said, we've got to keep using it. It's fine in the food and water. Don't worry about it. The scientists kept saying, no, it's not. It's not fine. The science built up to such a degree that it was scheduled to be banned entirely from agriculture in the US in 2017. The Obama administration, there were court rulings. The Obama administration said, we're going to ban it. Of course, then Donald Trump came into office in January 2017. Dow Chemical gave $1 million to the Trump inaugural fund and scheduled a meeting with the administration in April of 2017 and sat down and said, we don't want this ban to go forward. And the Trump administration said, okay, we're going to reverse it. The ban will not go forward. And that to me is just the most blatant, or one of the most blatant, I guess, examples of how politics trumps, no pun intended, public health policy. It's public health is rarely the priority over protection of corporate profits. And the chlorpyrifos situation is such a perfect example of that. It's something we should all be outraged about. And glyphosate is another one. There's an internal memo from the White House that we've gotten copies of, where a strategist, a consultant for Monsanto, is talking to White House people and comes back and reports to Monsanto that the White House says it's got your back. White House has Monsanto's back on glyphosate. You don't have to worry about regulation. So,
What year was that? What administration was that one?
that was during the Trump administration.
Wow, that's something. So let's talk about your new book, the Monsanto Papers. Why did you write that book? What gave you the strength to write it?
The first book, Whitewash, was really a heavy scientific book, I think, a book about the history of the chemical and its environmental impacts and regulatory situation and European involvement, and really about the whole history of genetically modified crops and glyphosate and Roundup. So it wasn't a fun book to write. It's probably not a fun book to read. A lot of people thought it was really an important book, educated a lot of people. I was asked to speak all around the world, including to the European Parliament, to talk about the findings and revelations in my book, which were based on a lot of government documents. This book, I really wanted to be about, what does it all mean to every man on the street? What does it mean? And what it means is the story of Lee Johnson. This guy in California, just working guy, and he's got 2 kids, and he sprays a lot of, glyphosate, Roundup, weed killers for his job. He's a groundskeeper for a school district. And he has this accidental exposure where he's doused in this chemical, and he develops this really horrible type of non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And he's told he's going to die in 18 months. And so it's the story of this guy and his family and his battle with cancer and his suffering and his struggle to live, and then his struggle to take Monsanto to court and to prove that this chemical causes cancer. And he became the first person in the world to take Monsanto to court and to expose all of these additional internal documents that showed the company, had been deceiving people for so long about the risks of its products. And so I just, as I followed the case and I got to know this guy and his family and the lawyers and the evidence and got copies of I thought this is an incredible human story that needs to be captured in some way. So I wrote a book. So it's a human story. It's a drama. A lot of people say it's like a Grisham novel. It was a lot more fun to write and hopefully more fun to read.
And he was awarded $289 million.
He was awarded $289 million in a unanimous jury decision. $250 million was considered punitive damages because the jury found that Monsanto had acted so egregiously in trying to cover up a lot of the risks of the products. But subsequent judges and appeals by Monsanto winnowed that down pretty dramatically, and his final judgment was down to $20 million, $20.5 million. And the irony, the just tragedy of that is because he was expected to die so soon, the judges decided he couldn't be awarded such a high level of damages because he wasn't going to suffer for years and years and years. He wasn't going to live a long life. He wasn't going to have medical bills that, went on for 10, 20 years. He was going to die quickly. So he didn't need a big award is basically what it came down to.
And he's still alive.
And he's still alive. He's managed to hold off the cancer, although he's not doing well at all.
How much of that 20 million went to his lawyers?
Yeah, and then you get down to that. With a lot of this litigation, there's a 40% cut that goes to the lawyers, and oftentimes there are liens. People don't understand, but oftentimes if your cancer is treated by Medicare or Medicaid, paid by those government funds, a lot of times if you get a jury decision, you get a big award, then you have to pay that money back, which is hitting a lot of these plaintiffs in the Roundup litigation really hard as they're coming to understand that.
Talk a little bit about Mike Miller, his attorney.
Yeah, Mike Miller is in the book. These are all, characters that look like they came out of a movie. Really, Mike Miller is this, big, loud, very gregarious, charismatic, old Southern lawyer, who's built, his wealth and his career and reputation on taking on pharmaceutical companies and others. He'd never taken on an agrochemical company, never taken on Monsanto or anyone like Monsanto. And but he saw this classification from the World Health Organization, and he thought, there's something here. And he took his firm in Virginia, kind of a small little firm in a little tiny town in Virginia, and said, I think we're going to take him on. And he filed a lawsuit and filed for discovery and was able to pry open Monsanto's secret, records and bring a lot of these into a giant database where they could be searched and come to light. And yeah, he's a very important guy. In the book, not to give too much away though, just on the eve of Lee's trial, he suffers a really tragic accident that keeps him out of the courtroom. And so he's not able. And then one of his backup guys has a terrible event and is not, as I said, as I was reporting all this and watching it unfold, I just thought it's got to be a movie. And I don't know how to write, I don't make a movie. So I made a book instead. But
how did Lee Johnson find Mike Miller?
Mike was advertising once he decided that's what this is. The book also examines this sort of mass tort system, this giant mechanism for bringing, multi-district litigation, or mass tort is what they call it, where you have thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of plaintiffs. And this Roundup litigation, for instance, people suing Monsanto, claiming exposure to Roundup gave them non-Hodgkin lymphoma. There are over 100,000 plaintiffs just in the United States. And so this became this mass tort, and Mike Miller became one of the leaders of the mass tort for all of these plaintiffs, although not all of them were his clients. So, this is really important, and I explore a lot of this in my book. It's, these plaintiffs' attorneys, we call them personal injury attorneys. These people are often widely attacked, and they're called ambulance chasers, and they say they exploit people, and they get this huge cut, and the people get nothing. But what you see is, if our regulators aren't doing their jobs, these lawyers are often the only avenue for people who've been injured, or had loved ones die because of faulty products, medical devices, drugs that haven't been thoroughly tested and have terrible side effects, or these chemicals used in agriculture that cause disease and death. So without a more robust and responsible regulatory system, consumers really have nowhere else to turn other than these attorneys.
Mike Miller asked for all these documents from Monsanto. I mean, millions of pages, I guess it is. And they sent it.
They did. Yeah, there's a meeting that I recount in the book where Mike and his team sit down for the first time with Monsanto's people and say, here are all these documents that we want. And they said, Monsanto's lawyers seemed very undisturbed and not worried at all, and said, we'll give them to you, but you're not going to find anything. We have no reason for concern. And they did. They ended up turning over about 15 million pages of internal documents. Now, they wanted to keep as many of them secret as they could. They didn't want them publicized or part of the court records. But the lawyers were ultimately able to get many of them released. And of course, many came to light during the trial and are described in my book. But Monsanto was sure wrong, because it was these internal secrets that caused not only jury in Lee's case, but two subsequent trials. The final trial, where these documents were revealed, the jury awarded the plaintiffs $2 billion.
It's crazy. I mean, I'm just amazed that they released the documents. I figured maybe they would hide them or whatever, but they released them.
Well, and of course, we don't know if they released all of them that they were supposed to, or that they were ordered to turn over. But yeah, I mean, they were ordered by court to turn over these discovery documents, and they certainly aren't by any means the entirety of Monsanto's internal communications, but they are enough to give a pretty big window into these years and years and years of what they were thinking, what they were talking about. They show these discussions about ghostwriting scientific papers to try to defend glyphosate. They talk about plans to discredit people like the scientists who work for the World Health Organization. They talk about colluding or working closely with the EPA to try to stop or block examinations of glyphosate by a different health agency in the United States government. All of these things that show that they're very eager to protect their product with very little regard for public health.
How does that work? How do they put together this ghostwriting and these front groups and this whole astroturfing to kind of shame the other side? How do they do that? How does that work?
Well, there are many different strategies that we saw. They used front groups. They were providing money to organizations that look like they're independent science groups, but they provide money, and then these groups promote the safety and tear into or harass people who say it looks like glyphosate causes cancer, for instance. These groups will then try to discredit these people. In my case, there was a plan. We got a copy of the document from internal Monsanto records where They wanted to discredit my book and discredit me, and they talked about using third parties, again, these front groups, but also getting using Google search engine optimization and getting somehow using things. So if people were searching for my name or the name of my book, they would get directed to, horrible things about things that were written about me that they engineered to be written about me. But these ghost written studies and research papers, they would talk about we need an independent party, a scientist who doesn't work for us,
The independent professors.
to have their names on the papers. We'll do the work, we'll do the editing and the writing, but they'll put their names on them and we'll pay them. And, they did this. We see in the internal documents, they did this multiple times.
There was a Forbes article, Henry Miller. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, Henry Miller was an academic who, unfortunately for him, was caught as one of the people that Monsanto was using for ghostwritten articles. They wanted an article in Forbes magazine that would criticize this WHO group, this World Health Organization group of scientists, and proclaim the safety of glyphosate and stress, that it was not a cancer concern. And so they wanted, a third party name, and Henry Miller was going to be the guy. And you can see in the documents where they send him, hey, this would be great if you have this article, and here's what it should say. And actually, here's a draft of the article. And you see then it's published in Forbes, and it's what Monsanto's PR people wrote. It's from the draft that they gave Henry Miller, is you see that show up in Forbes under Henry Miller's name. So when those documents came out, Forbes, of course, was embarrassed, and they removed his articles. And but there, as I said, the documents show many different examples of this.
And there was EPA documents with Jess Rowland. If you could just go over that email.
Yeah, so with Jess Rowland, this really interesting email, series of emails really. Jess Rowland was an EPA official who was in charge of the cancer review of glyphosate for the EPA, and his report came out and found that there was no reason to be concerned that glyphosate didn't cause cancer. And this was after the International Agency for Research on Cancer. So this was something that was somewhat controversial, but you see in Monsanto's own documents where they say that Jess Rowland is a friend and that he can be helpful in the defense of glyphosate. And they look to Jess for a lot of insider information. And in particular, when they are looking to block this separate federal agency from looking too closely at glyphosate toxicity, they talk about going to Jess, and they say that Jess has said he will try to help them, and if he can kill it, he should get a medal. And they talk then about other EPA officials as well that they worked with to try to block this other agency, and they were successful in delaying this other agency from looking at glyphosate for years.
My last question to you, and I just want to thank you so much for your time. What could people do? What are some of the solutions? Can they get screened, get labs, and what lab would they do? And also, should we label or ban this stuff? What are some of the solutions?
The solutions, I think, are, again, come down to individual education, awareness, and action. And you decide for yourself what that action is, whether it is just changing your diet, or if it involves, going to Capitol Hill, or if it's as simple as, telling your school board, please don't use this on our school grounds. But I think everybody has to see where they are and decide for themselves. But we do need to understand better. And I've been speaking with environmental medicine doctors who seem to be increasingly aware and concerned, and offering to help people understand better, their own chemistry and what kind of chemical compounds they might be contaminated with. And so there are ways, if you care about it and you want to improve your health, you can do it.
And if people want to find out more about you and they want to get copies of your book, what's the best way for them to do it?
Thanks. My website is careygillam.com. I work for a research group now called US Right to Know, which is usrtk.org. And I write a lot for The Guardian. So you can Google Guardian and Carey Gillam, and you can get a whole list of my articles.
Well, I want to thank Carey Gillam for joining me today. She's a wealth of information. You've learned about pesticides and herbicides A to Z, and she was very generous with her time. So thank you so much for joining me. This is Dr. Carey Gillam for Open Your Eyes. Fitting multifocal contact lenses presents a big opportunity to meet patient needs while growing your practice. Alcon is your partner not only with our innovative portfolio, but through e-learning. Learn to enhance your multifocal strategy today with the Alcon Experience Academy.
Since I bought Safe for You, my dad makes me clean his boat.
Es natural y es un buen producto.
Every time I go back to school, my mom always makes sure that I have my Safe for You products. I bring extra, and my roommates certainly don't mind.
It's a good thing I had Safe for You to clean up after this little guy.
When my hands get dry, I like to wash them with Safe for You.
And most importantly, the reason why I buy Safe for You is because it's safe for me and you.